Welcome to another episode of Florida History during the Second Seminole War. And it's coming up to Veterans Day, so I wore my veterans jacket here from the Gulf War, which is the war I served in 30 years ago. And I was researching on the Battle of Okeechobee and the Battle of Waxahachie. Some people had asked me to do some research on that. And my opinion is there's no such thing as hidden history, that everything's out there, that you'll eventually find it. Half the stuff I run across in the newspaper articles is stuff I run across by accident. And it's neat stuff, but it answers one question. I didn't necessarily find the information I was looking for on the Battle of Waxahachie, but I did find this neat newspaper article. And let's see if I can do a screen share. I always have to. Okay, here we are. And this is dealing with the appropriations, monetary appropriations from the House Committee for the Seminole War in 1838. It's a very interesting debate. Nothing's hidden out there. And it's interesting from what they debate. There's no question on what the war was about and what was going on and what caused the war, because this debate, with about 2 years into it, kind of covers it all. So I just wanted to give everybody insight into what's being debated in Congress. The men in this debate are Charles Downing, the delegate of Florida. Florida is still a territory, it's not a state, so they don't have representatives or senators, they have delegates to Congress. Charles Downing lived from 1797 to 1841. He's buried in St. Augustine. He probably died during the yellow fever epidemic. Very important legislative figure in the early territorial days. Henry Wise of Virginia, he's a former governor, but this was when he was in the House of Representatives. And Horace Everett, a representative famous from Vermont, who lived from 1779 and 1851. Horace Everett is a relative of Edward Everett. If you are familiar with Edward Everett, who was governor and president of Harvard, also senator, minister to Great Britain, they're second cousins. In fact, speaking of Horace Everett, there was another Horace Everett I want to tell you about real quick. You know, probably Dr. Jacob Mott, Journey into Wilderness, his account of the Seminole War. This book was published in 1963, before Dr. Mann's book. And this basically is journal. The Seminole War. We're wanting to do I guess a sequel to that or a reprint, just go over through it, redo the notes. But there's another book from his journal that you might not know about. And this is it here. It's called A Charleston Goes to Harvard, Diary of a Harvard Student in 1831. And that's Jacob Mott's journal from when he was a student at Harvard. One of Jacob Mott's friends was also Horace Everett. Of course, they're all related. They're second cousins. Horace Everett at Harvard eventually became a priest. So speaking of Horace Everett, I have a clock that was owned by Horace Everett. This is about a 80-year-old clock from that I got from a relative. I don't want to show that off. Okay, let's go back to the screen share. So Horace Everett is from Vermont. And where is it? Okay, this is from the Selma Free Press, February 3rd, 1838. just a few days after Osceola died at Fort Moultrie, South Carolina, although they're probably not aware of it at the time. It hadn't made the press yet. And also about a week after the Battle of Waxahachie in 1838, and the same newspaper had about the Battle of Okeechobee. But this is very interesting what it says, but because it really covers the war very succinctly. Washington, January 23rd, 1838. In fact, January 23rd is the day before the Battle of Waxahachie and near Jupiter Inlet in Florida. More appropriations for the Seminole War. Mr. Wise and Mr. Downing and company debating a most interesting debate, the Steamboat Bill in the Senate. Of course, they get off subject talking about the Seminole War appropriations. This morning, the House went into committee of the whole to take into consideration a newly reported appropriation bill proposing the expenditure of $1 million to continue to carry on the Seminole War. Mr. Wise opposed the bill. He took a review of the circumstances connected with these campaigns and denounced the whole war as having been begun in deception, continued with imbecility and recklessness, and ended in shame and disgrace. Of course, it's not ended yet, but at this point they're wondering if it's kind of being wrapped up. He contended that there is no proof that there was now any war upon the Florida frontier, and stamped the whole affair as one for the advantage of speculating contractors and the satisfying of government officers' appetites for spoils, and for one, until a thorough examination of the true state of our affairs in that quarter, he would not vote for any more millions of appropriations to be lavished upon this war. He says, pretty much the money in the war is going in people's pockets. It's like, isn't that true for every war? Mr. Charles Downing retorted and said the delegate from Florida spoke earnestly in favor of the bill and sustained the necessity of such an appropriation as was proposed by the bill. He contended that a strong necessity did exist for the appropriation and denied that any speculating government contractors were to be found at all in Florida. Actually, they were, and I found evidence in the Adjutant General and the Quartermaster papers, but back to our newspaper article. Such speculators were at a distance while the people of Florida were suffering from the raging of these cruel wars. Mr. Downing was not averse to the proposed investigations to Mr. Wise had alluded, and was willing that those investigations should be entrusted to a committee of the gentleman's own choosing. Mr. Downing is very vigorous, but somewhat homely speaker, and vindicated his side of this question with a good deal of power and pertinacity of argument. Hey, that's just how they write these things back then. I'm sorry. He was quite humorous and sarcastic withal in his retorts upon Messrs. Bells, Wise, and others who had spoken at diverse times in opposition to the administration's mode of carrying on these campaigns. He said, among other things, that a new standard had been raised to the extent to which an Indian war should be carried on. When it had reached $5 million, it must cease. Of course, that's only about a quarter of what the war spent. We must fight up to that amount and then stop. If these Indians would show fair field or foul field, they could be met and defeated. But this was the first time he had ever heard of such a position taken as that now assumed in relation to these campaigns. Mr. Wise had alluded to the fraudulent of the treaty with the Seminoles in which the war began. Of course, he's talking about the Treaty of Payne's Landing. And Mr. Downing had never heard, he said, such an aspersion against that treaty before. Well, I guess he must have been asleep in Congress during earlier arguments. He did not know the number of Seminoles or whether the estimate made a few days since by a gentleman of Kentucky, Mr. Underwood, upon the authority of anonymous letter were or were not correct, but he thought in a singular doctrine that when 10,000 men were found insufficient to accomplish a purpose, it was proper to withdraw one half of these men from the contest. Mr. Downing spoke with warm and disadvantageous position occupied by Florida as a territory and exposed to an attempt from some quarters to fix the Seminole Indians permanently on their soil, from other quarters to free the slaves. But, said Mr. Downing, you shall not locate those Indians among us, and you shall not free our slaves. So that's, Mr. Downing says it right there. How dare you keep the Indians here in Florida among us? And no way are you going to free our slaves. Certainly, this war is about slavery. That's just one of the reasons. Mr. Wise rejoined and defended his former positions and insisted upon necessity of a thorough investigation in the late campaigns before any more appropriations were made. He told the delegation from Florida that would be a heavy task upon looking over the files of the War Department to free that department from all blame in this matter. Before he would vote for more appropriations, he would call on the Secretary of War for the amount of money expended and how all the treasures already appropriate had been expended. And that will be in another congressional investigation report in 1840. He estimated the expense of these campaigns at something like $73,000 per diem and asked how much nearer was this war to an end now than when the delegate's predecessor, Colonel White, first made his pathetic appeal to Congress. He contended in reply to Mr. Downing that there was not a treaty, but a fraudulent one with the Seminoles. The Indians believed and had reason to believe that their children would be kidnapped and sold as slaves by the whites under the sanction of the government, and that there had been no army sent to Florida to overawe and to prevent impending hostilities when such a step would have been useful to that end. And he's contending, that's the army's been sent to round up slaves. Mr. Wise inadverted upon bad faith with which General Jesup treated the Seminole chief as treacherous and perfidious. Once again, that's the language of the day. Mr. Downing interrupted Mr. Wise here and said that so far from blaming that officer that he, Mr. Downing, been General Jesup, he would not only have captured him, and they're talking about Osceola, but would have hanged him up to the crooked branches of a yellow pine. Mr. Wise went on and said that he could easily understand the personal feelings which prompted such a threat, but from what he knew of that gentleman, Mr. D, he did not believe that he would really put such a purpose in execution if in his power. And he went on to comment on the perfidy and treachery of the last line. That page is obscured. And upon the letters of that officer in relation to the Cherokee mediatorial delegation, delegation. The Cherokee mediatorial delegation. Okay, I'm sorry. Even I'm having trouble with this. These letters from General Jesup were read on motion of Mr. Everett of Vermont and by the assent of Mr. Wise. They showed that early in December, the opinions of the general were favorable to the good faith of the Cherokee delegation. Mr. Downing, then by Mr. Wise's request, read two letters, one of which was from the postmaster at St. Augustine, declaring that the Seminoles Allegheny Jumper had said that the Cherokee delegation had told the Seminoles that if they would hold out this winter, they would be successful, as Congress would refuse to appropriate any more money to carry on the war. That is a false rumor that people were believing at the time, that the Cherokees told the Seminoles just to hold out and the Americans would give up. And that was being circulated in St. Augustine in the papers. And of course, it wasn't true. But of course, here it is in the newspapers. Mr. Wise then went on to say that he too had received letters from good men and good witnesses upon this subject, one of whom was the writer of one of the very letters read by Mr. D, and that if the power party here could ever be brought to order, such an investigation as he had striven to obtain, he should depend upon the writer as one of his main witnesses to substantiate his charges against the administration in conducting the war. He argued that this was another instance of bad faith on part of the government in attempting to throw this odium on the Cherokee mediators to cover up the miserable policy of the War Department in relation to the Seminoles. He was very eloquent in his denunciation of the whole general policy of General Jackson and his successor, that's Martin Van Buren, in relation to the Aborigines, and urged with much pathos and force the more humane and general policy of Virginia towards these unhappy people. So this is a congressman from Virginia speaking against the war, which is pretty interesting, speaking against slavery too. His comparison between the natural and inevitable results of these two modes of treating Indians was drawn upon with great ability, and the whole speech stamped him anew, in my estimation, as a man of the most noble feelings, the purest character of a man and a philanthropist, as well as a statesman and a patriot. The debate continued by Messrs. Thompson, Everett, Chili, Haynes, Bell, Robinson, Kelbridge, and Wide, and extended an hour so late as to prevent the possibility of giving you more minute account of the latter part of it. And the go into it, Mr. Wise moved to reduce the proposed appropriation by 1/2 from $1 million to $500,000. The Senate have had the steamboat bill under their consideration all day, as this debate was upon a subject the whole merits of which lie in a nutshell are understood very well by your readers. Will excuse me, I bestowed most of my time and attention and have not asked all theirs to proceed in the House today. So this bill was really about another one, and I get off and talking about appropriation on the Seminole War instead. A few takeaways from this debate. Mr. Wise said that the war was begun in deception, continued with imbecility and recklessness, and ended in shame and disgust. Shame and disgrace. And I would certainly agree with that. And Mr. Downing from Florida said, "You shall not locate these Indians among us." The capitals and capital letters, "You shall not free our slaves." That's why he's very adamant. Can't keep the Indians here and don't free our slaves. Mr. Wise asked, how much nearer was this war to an end? There was not a treaty, but a fraudulent one. The Indians believed that their children would be kidnapped and sold as slaves. And General Jesup treated the Seminole chief in bad faith and treachery. Mr. Downing said that if he were Jesup, he would not only have captured Osceola, but hanged him. Mr. Wise said that the government is wanting to blame the failure of the Cherokee delegation to cover up its own miserable policy in relation to the Seminoles. I'll agree with that one too. Mr. Wise was very eloquent in denouncing the whole policy of General Jackson and Martin Van Buren in relation to the Native people, and urged much pathos and humane treatment. Mr. Wise motioned to reduce the proposed appropriation by 1/2. And of course, this is a debate that's going in Congress for next few years. Here's another article from 6 months later from the Liberator. I think this is an abolitionist newspaper. I think it's coming from Baltimore. And it says correspondence with the Baltimore Congress. From the anti-slavery newspaper. Okay, argument, shall Florida become a slave state? And the speaker on this is mostly Horace Everett, once again from the Vermont. And I'll just read part of it. And he's saying, but why make Florida a slave state? Because forsooth, it is a slaveholder's will. Florida was not part of the original Union. She cannot pretend that we have a compromise with her promising to sacrifice liberty and justice at her bidding. Till 1819, the territory being under the government of Spain occasioned great vexation to slaveholders, to affording a refuge from slavery. After protracted negotiations, it is brought under the Republican government at a cost of $5 million. Actually, that's $5 million canceling the debt. And this is what Mr. Everett says: hungry men stealers soon snatched at their prey. Honorable Horace Everett from Vermont, in a speech to Congress, June 3rd, 1836. Okay, so this 2 years earlier, quotes from General Wiley Thompson's letters as follows: October 28th, 1834. There are many likely Negroes in this nation. Some of the whites in adjacent settlements manifest a restless desire to obtain them. So there's a lot of slave catchers who want to capture these free Black people living aside the Seminoles. April 27th, 1835, the Negroes in this nation dread the idea of being sold from their present state of ease and comparative liberty to bondage and hard labor under overseers on sugar and cotton plantations. They have always had a great influence on the Indians. The Indians would almost as soon sell his child as his slave. John Lee Williams in his Florida published is this John Lee Williams book, The Territory of Florida, published in 1827, though evidently disposed to conceal the worst of the truth, says, great exertions have been made to get the Indian Negroes away by false claims, and many Negroes have taken away by force and fraud. You know, sorry for the language, it wouldn't be what we do today. I wouldn't say that these free Black people are living in ease. You know, they're having a rough time like everybody. Washington correspondent on the New York Journal of Commerce, June 3rd, 1836, said that was stated on the floor of Congress and uncontradicted that our government recognized the claim of the slaveholders and sent agents to kidnap the children of the Seminoles. So the slaveholders are not only kidnapping the Blacks, but are kidnapping Seminole children and Seminoles and putting them in slavery as well. General Thompson called on more forces, and the war began. It has been protracted on one side by desperations of fugitive slaves, preferring death to slavery, and the following from a Mobile, Alabama newspaper on March 28th, 1838 shows why it is continued on the other, is the power to entice away and instruct in bushfighting so many of our slaves that we would wish to annihilate. These Seminoles cannot remain in the peninsula of Florida without threatening the internal safety of the South. Southern men have estimated that the expense of the war at $20 million of its, and that's actually pretty true, of its destruction to life. The Army and Navy Chronicle says, appraised as we have been the deadly service to Florida in which our gallant army has been since 1835 engaged, we were not a little surprised to learn the great mortality among its officers and men. And, of course, interesting, if I may go back a bit, that, you know, slaveholders saying that the Seminole War, the Seminoles in Florida is threatening the whole institution of slavery and the whole South, threatening, which would threaten slavery, would threaten the economic collapse of the South, which would happen 25 years later anyway. Free men of the North, have you done enough for slavery in Florida? Will you strangle the honor and prosperity of your country and bury them with your children's liberty? Let the North open up her dumb mouth, cut the string of her tied tongue, rebuke and thunder her dough-faced politicians and make them warning beacons to the betrayers of liberty in all coming time, a certain sign of perdition in all political Judas who impiously sell their masters. Let their people rescue Florida from slavery and secure it from liberty. Don't let it be a slave state. So those are some interesting news articles. And you know, as I said, nothing's hidden in history. You just have to read the newspapers. Very interesting how they say that the Seminole Wars threatening the whole institutions of slavery and the economy of the South. So thought you might find that interesting. I think I'll leave it at that. And hopefully you have a good Veterans Day. I'll be at the American Legion Hall. We have a breakfast in the morning of the 11th, Thursday, coming up Thursday morning. It's free for veterans. And then there's the Veterans Parade in downtown Tallahassee. Not sure if I'll make that one or not. Depends if I could get my car in there, get a place to park. Anyway, everybody, stay warm, and I'll talk to you later.